I'd really like to hear your views on the role of the Supreme Court in America as an influencer on American culture, and whether you think their worldviews or the worldviews of the members of the High Court have helped change America much in over the last 50 or 60 years.
Well, one sign of the transformation of the Supreme Court is that if you were to go back and ask the average American 50 years ago to name a justice of the Supreme Court, they'd be unlikely to be able to do so. But now, you've got farmers in Kansas and protesters in Portland who know the names of all of the justices of the Supreme Court. That's not how it was intended. But, there are several valid democratic or ordered liberty arguments. One of them is a parliamentary system, such as you have, and the other is the constitutional system of divided government, as we have a federal system. And the fact is that parliamentary systems are more efficient, simply because if you have a majority in the government, you can pretty much get whatever the populace elects as the majority of the government. It can happen. And rather efficiently. Our system of government was based upon slowing the passions of people down rather than accelerating them. And so as you look at the division of powers between the legislature and the executive and the judicial in the United States, the least progressive of all, so to speak, was to be the nation's highest court. It was to be the ultimate check on any unconstitutional actions that might be undertaken by the legislature or by the executive, by the president. And then it, of course, has just an enormous procedural responsibility in interpreting the laws and huge questions that arise in any civilization. So throughout most of American history, the Supreme Court functioned largely in the background of the nation's consciousness. But all that changed in the midpoint of the 20th century, when a progressivist revolution in politics eventually came to the courts, and where you had a succession of progressivist presidents, and frankly, you had a change in the culture of law, where you had an entire new generation of activists who saw the law and the courts as the way to achieve what they couldn't get legislatively. See, that's a huge issue. You take the issue of abortion. Congress at any point could legislate the issue of abortion, could either determine that abortion is legal or illegal. It doesn't have the political nerve to do so. And furthermore, the fact that our members of Congress are elected by districts, they're answerable to those districts. So, and the senators are electable to their states, and the president has to run for election. And so it turns out that the courts would be far more efficient as engines of social revolution. And so those who are trying to achieve that revolution turn to the courts, because they could never have gotten, say, a Roe law through, but they got a majority on the Supreme Court, Roe v. Wade, 1973. Congress could never have politically legislated the legalization of same-sex marriage. And you might say that's inefficient, but I think that's our constitutional order at work. It slows down bad ideas. But they said, well, the court we can use to just escape that limitation. And so I hope that's making sense. But it was turning the courts into the engines of a progressive ideology. They were too impatient to wait for Congress and the president to act on these matters.
Does this feed directly into the idea that's, I think, clearly emerging, that today's, for want of a better term, technocrats, the people who have the megaphones and to a large extent the influence and their hands on the levers of power, essentially don't really believe in the democracy. You can't trust the people to get it right. We know better than they do.
Absolutely. And, there have always been elites. There's an elite in every society. And as Edmund Burke recognized, there's a hierarchy in every society, whether it's honest or noble or not. Of course, we want an honest and noble hierarchy. And that's been transformed into the idea of meritocracy in modern societies of liberty. But, that requires the people to be involved. And again, that's very inefficient if you're a social engineer and a technocrat and a member of the intellectual elite, and you know better. So you've got to find a way to go around the people, because even like you take any number of issues in the United States, you take the technocrats, and I like the fact you use that term. They see a nation as nothing more than a high-tech corporation. They make decisions on an instant. It's an entirely top-down, a form of management, and why can't you do that in a society? And so what you see is that the left has been incredibly frustrated with the fact that they're not going to get their aims by democratic means. And so, yes, they're very frustrated with people. And so there was a book written decades ago in the United States, What's the Matter with Kansas? And it was written by someone from the left asking, why do these people in Kansas vote against their self-interest? But of course, people in Kansas weren't voting against their self-interest. They just didn't have the self-interest goals, the vision of life that the intellectual elites thought they should have.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I've been to Kansas quite a few times because of my rural interests, and it's right in the heartland of America. And I often wonder why the heartland of America somehow allows or seems impotent to change things. And yet, I almost speak against myself. Surely that's what Trump was about. If I can put it this way, some people would say Trump is the problem, but wouldn't it be more accurate to see that he was the result of the problem? That this disregard for the views of the mainstream by those elites, those technocrats, those others who think they know best for us as well as for themselves, produced an enormous backlash, which really was a revolution in the Republican Party as much as it was in American society at large.
Right. So you have these two parties, and they basically played the same political game for most of the 20th century. And then they began to play very contrary playbooks. And yet, if you look at the Republican Party, or you look at conservatism, conservatives in the United States, as in many other Western nations, basically have seen themselves playing a losing game of defense for a matter of decades. Trump came in and on the scene and said, I'm not playing by the old Republican playbook. I don't want to lose more slowly. I want to break up. I want to change the rules of the game. And there were enough Americans. And by the way, it was the Electoral College where Trump won. And so to make your point, it was Kansas who affected that change. It didn't come from San Francisco. And the Electoral College and the United States Senate are two of the ways in the United States of making sure that Kansas still matters. And so you look at the electoral map from 2016 when Trump was elected, and it was the very people who said, I just don't even trust that the old Republican playbook, still too cosmopolitan, still too concerned with playing defense, still too much concerned with reaching consensus. I don't agree with that anymore. Now, in 2020, there's a mixed record of what it means to have someone who plays by a completely different playbook. But at the same time, the left has not only doubled down on its playbook, it's moving in even more radical directions. So we're looking at the stakes being even higher in 2020 than they were in 2016.
Yeah, extraordinary that there's been no real concession to that pent-up frustration and desire to meet people and to address their concerns. Technocrats still know best, if I can put it that way, and nothing will change their views. There's an extraordinary arrogance about it. It's one of the marks, I think, of Western culture. We've lost what used to be a very big thing in Australia. It was huge. My father drummed it into me all the time. Show a sense of proportion. Don't be, as he might have put it, on yourself. Listen to the other person. That's dead. We neither listen nor forgive, and apparently can't forget either. So it's very hard to build relationship.
Yeah. Look at the condescension that's been coming from the left for decades. And it also explains some of their frustration. So their condescension, 40 years ago was, we're right, they're wrong, and eventually they will come to be illuminated and agree we're right. Well, of course, that just didn't happen. And so now it's, you think of the language used by Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, now those conservatives are deplorables, are unworthy. And so what you see is that on the left, there's a very anti-democratic sense. It really doesn't matter what people in Kansas and Ohio and Indiana think. What the people in San Francisco and New York think is simply going to happen. Deal with it.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.